The administration's so-called Waters of the U.S. regulation would grant federal bureaucrats domination over nearly every piece of land that has ever touched a pothole, ditch, or puddle at some point. It would force the Americans who live there to ask federal bureaucrats for permission to do just about anything on their own property. We're not talking about just a few acres falling under bureaucratic control here and there. According to an analysis by the American Farm Bureau, we're talking about centralized federal control extending to nearly 92% of Wisconsin, 95% of California, 98% of New York, 99% of Pennsylvania, and if you can believe this, 100% of Virginia, the entire state. This isn't some clean water regulation. It's an unprecedented federal power grab that clumsily and poorly pretends to masquerade as one. It's obvious why waters of the U.S. would be a left-winger's dream. It's equally obvious why Democratic leaders would want to pretend this rule is about clean water rather than admit what it's really about, because the true purpose and scope of this regulation is basically indefensible. 31 states have already filed suit against it. 2 federal courts have already ruled that it's likely illegal. And one court found that the rule was so flawed that it had to be the result of a, quote, process that is inexplicable, arbitrary, and devoid of a reasoned process. That's why we considered the Bipartisan Federal Water Quality Protection Act yesterday. The legislation, it's bipartisan and it's simple. It says that EPA's resources should be used to actually protect the lakes and rivers we all cherish, rather than for the administration to launch arbitrary ideological attacks on middle-class homeowners and family farms. This bipartisan legislation would have required America's clean water rules to be based on the kind of scientific, collaborative process the American people expect, not some arbitrary or inflexible process that's devoid of reason, like we had with WOTUS, but a balanced process that actually takes the views of those it affects into serious consideration. I thank the senator from Wyoming, Senator Barrasso, for his impressive work on the bill. A bipartisan majority of the Senate voted to support it, but most Democrats chose an ideological power grab over sensible clean water rules yesterday. To many Kentuckians, this regulation feels a lot like the latest in a sustained Obama administration regulatory assault on their families. Well, the Senate's going to pursue another avenue today to protect the middle class from this unfair regulatory attack. Our colleague from Iowa, Senator Ernst, has introduced a measure that would allow Congress to move forward despite the Democratic filibuster. It would overturn the regulation in its entirety. A majority of the Senate voted to support this bill just yesterday. We'll vote on final passage later today. And because this measure cannot be filibustered, we expect it to pass. I would ask my colleagues who voted against bipartisan common sense clean water legislation yesterday to think differently today. Work with us to protect the middle class instead of defending a, quote, inexplicable, arbitrary regulation that's probably illegal and almost certainly violates the Clean Water Act.